Your presence in their thoughts is not emotional in the way it is commonly understood. Psychologically, it functions as a structural disturbance rather than an attachment. Patterns suggest that you occupy a position that interrupts their usual internal equilibrium. This is not longing, nor is it admiration. It is tension. Internally, something has been displaced, and the mind returns to the point of disturbance repeatedly, not to feel, but to stabilize. You are not being remembered for who you are, but for what you represent within their psychic architecture. Your existence presses against an unresolved configuration they rely on to maintain coherence. This is why the thought of you recurs without warmth. The mind circles you as it would a fracture line, attempting to assess pressure without acknowledging vulnerability. Psychologically, the repetition is defensive. The psyche revisits what it cannot integrate, hoping familiarity will neutralize disruption. Yet the disruption remains. Internally, this creates a low-grade unrest, subtle, controlled, but persistent. The thought of you does not resolve anything. It simply marks where resolution has failed. Patterns suggest that this fixation is less about connection and more about containment. You have become a reference point for something they cannot name without destabilizing their self-concept. The mind keeps you present as a way to hold that unnamed tension in place, not to explore it, not to feel it, simply to keep it from moving. Internally, this creates pressure without release, a quiet occupation of thought, a vigilance that has no object except you. What occupies them now is not you as a person, but a conflict that has been quietly activated by your presence. Psychologically, it is the tension between maintaining dominance and confronting an unfamiliar sense of internal insufficiency. Patterns suggest that their attention turns inward only when control no longer feels absolute. This is not reflection in the conscious sense. It is friction. Internally, the structure they rely on requires superiority, distance, and regulation of others. That structure remains intact, yet something presses against it. The mind registers this pressure as irritation, restlessness, or preoccupation. The need to dominate persists, but it no longer fully stabilizes the psyche. A subtle imbalance forms. Psychologically, dominance has always functioned as compensation. It protected against the recognition of lack. Now the compensation feels strained. Patterns suggest that an unfamiliar awareness has emerged, not fully conscious, but disruptive enough to weaken certainty. Internally, this creates a dilemma. To preserve dominance, the psyche must deny the disturbance. To acknowledge the disturbance risks exposing insufficiency. Your presence becomes associated with this tension, not as a cause, but as a point of activation. The mind oscillates between asserting control and withdrawing into guarded silence. Neither position fully resolves the internal pressure. Psychologically, this produces fixation without clarity. Internally, the conflict does not escalate outwardly. It remains contained, controlled, yet it consumes cognitive space. The psyche monitors itself, guarding against collapse while refusing integration. Patterns suggest that what holds their attention is not loss of power, but the faint perception that power alone is no longer sufficient. Beneath what appears composed, a quiet destabilization is already in motion. Psychologically, the familiar defenses remain active, but they are no longer effortless. Patterns suggest that mechanisms once relied upon to regulate emotion now require conscious maintenance. This alone signals strain. Internally, the system is working harder to produce the same outward stability. The disturbance does not announce itself dramatically. It moves subtly beneath awareness as an accumulation rather than an event. Psychologically, old defenses are still deployed: detachment, superiority, control, but they no longer fully absorb what presses against them. Something leaks through. Not emotion as feeling, but emotion as pressure. Internally, this creates a state of vigilance. The psyche monitors itself, sensing vulnerability without language for it. Patterns suggest that this is experienced as unease rather than insight. The structure resists collapse, yet the effort of resistance becomes perceptible. Silence grows heavier. Stillness feels less neutral. What destabilizes them is not exposure, but the strain of concealment. Psychologically, defenses function best when unconscious. Now they are partially visible to the self. This visibility weakens their authority. Internally, the mind compensates by tightening control elsewhere, often in thought rather than action. Your presence remains associated with this strain, not because you provoke it, but because you coincide with its emergence. Patterns suggest the psyche links timing rather than cause. As a result, attention returns to you during moments of internal imbalance. The destabilization remains contained, managed, yet it is real. Psychologically, this is the stage where defenses no longer feel protective, only necessary. Internally, that distinction matters. Their fixation persists because something essential has been activated without being accessible to conscious direction. Psychologically, the mind recognizes movement without understanding its origin. Patterns suggest this is experienced as a pull rather than a thought, an internal gravity that draws attention back to the same point. Internally, control is assumed, yet it fails to fully engage what has been stirred. What has been activated is not emotion in its expressive form. It is recognition without articulation. Psychologically, the psyche senses significance before meaning. This creates a state of suspension. Attention remains alert, but comprehension lags behind. The mind circles what it cannot enter. Internally, this produces a peculiar tension. The system attempts to manage the activation through familiar cognitive routes, yet none provide traction. Old strategies rely on clarity, hierarchy, and command. This disturbance resists those structures. Patterns suggest that the psyche responds by holding the activation at a distance, maintaining awareness without engagement. Your presence becomes the anchor point for this unresolved activation, not as an object of desire or conflict, but as a marker of when the internal shift occurred. Psychologically, the mind associates activation with proximity. This association sustains fixation even in absence. Internally, there is an effort to neutralize the activation by observing it. Watching replaces feeling. Monitoring replaces integration. The psyche remains poised, alert to further movement, yet unwilling to relinquish control. This is why the fixation does not progress or resolve. Psychologically, it remains suspended between recognition and authority. Internally, something essential has been touched, but not yet claimed by the conscious self. As the internal disturbance deepens, its focus gradually shifts. Psychologically, Attention turns away from managing external dynamics and toward regulating what has begun to surface internally. Patterns suggest this transition is subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it alters the direction of psychic effort. Control is no longer exercised outwardly by default. It is redirected inward. Internally, the familiar strategies still exist. Monitoring others, maintaining position, preserving hierarchy. Yet these no longer fully occupy the psyche. Something closer demands attention. Psychologically, this is experienced as a quiet preoccupation rather than a crisis. The mind checks itself more often. Thought becomes self-referential. What emerges is not insight, but awareness. Patterns suggest the psyche recognizes a presence within that cannot be dismissed through external regulation alone. This awareness does not clarify. It complicates. Internally, the system attempts to apply control to itself, using the same mechanisms once reserved for others. This produces strain. Psychologically, self-monitoring lacks the stabilizing effect of outward dominance. There is no object to manage, no feedback to confirm control. Only an internal signal that persists. Attention remains occupied not by fear, but by vigilance. Your presence remains linked to this phase, not actively, but symbolically. Internally, you represent the threshold between outward mastery and inward disturbance. The psyche does not move past this marker. It orients around it. Patterns suggest that at this stage, awareness can no longer be fully externalized. The mind holds itself under observation. Psychologically, this is unfamiliar terrain. Internally, something has shifted from avoidance to containment. Not resolution, not collapse. Simply sustained attention directed inward, where it has rarely been required before. What you have been observing is not an exchange, but an internal process unfolding in proximity to you. Psychologically, their preoccupation reflects a struggle that remains largely invisible because it does not seek expression. Patterns suggest that what appears as distance, fixation, or silence is the mind attempting to regulate an internal imbalance without language for it. You are not witnessing intention, but containment. Internally, this struggle does not move toward resolution. It stabilizes itself through attention, vigilance, and repetition. The psyche maintains function while quietly accommodating pressure it cannot yet integrate. What occupies their thoughts is not conflict with you, but confrontation with something newly activated within themselves. This awareness reframes the dynamic. It removes drama and replaces it with structure. Psychologically, nothing is being decided in the usual sense. Something is simply being held in place long enough to remain manageable. Your role in this is symbolic rather than personal, a reference point rather than a cause. The quiet truth is this: when the psyche turns inward against its own defenses, the most visible change is not action, but sustained attention to what can no longer be ignored.